Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 3 of What is America? This week we'll be discussing Afrofuturism, but in order to do that, we have to talk about the context of Afrofuturism in the US first, which means we got to talk about race, blackness, anti-black racism, and the history of black organizing. Um, so, race in the US is well, first we have to talk about race in general, right? What is race? I'm sure you've heard this before, but it's a social construct, which is to say, it's a way that we categorize each other that is determined by the context in which we're doing the categorizing. How we see each other as groups of people depends on the context in which we're living, specifically sociopolitical and economic realities and power differentials. Who's in power, who they're exercising that power to control, and what the realities of those relationships are, right? So race was defined differently during enslavement than it was during World War II, than it was during the 1960s, than it is now. In other words, race is historical. It changes over time. All that is to say, it's not biological, right? Not at all. There's no biological difference between races. But that doesn't mean race isn't real. Just because it's not a biological reality doesn't mean it's not a reality. We constructed it, right? We made it up societally, but its effects are very real because the stakes of these categorizations have life and death implications for the people being categorized. But yeah, race is historical. We see this in our census data. In the 70s, we only had 3 racial categories in the census versus in the 2020s, we have a lot. That's not because there are new groups of people. It's because we started defining each other differently. And this didn't begin in the 70s, right? We've been defining each other differently throughout history. Despite the fact that race doesn't have a biological reality underpinning it, people have been trying to use science to justify racism for as long as we've had science. Like any tool, we are going to use it based on how we want it to be used. So if you're making racist assumptions and you're doing science, your science is probably going to be inflected by those racist assumptions. This is shaped a lot of different disciplines. Anthropology has a history of something called physical anthropology, which was when anthropologists would go out around the world on fieldwork and collect people's bones and measure people, often with tools called calipers, which are like these almost like a compass, but instead of using it to draw a circle, you're unscrewing it to measure the width of someone's nose or eyebrow or the crown of their head, things like that. And then you record all that data. It sounds like it wouldn't be that big of a deal, but for starters, there's a lot of consent issues with this. There's also a lot of grave robbing happening, and that's still an issue today because a lot of museums and universities and archives have stolen human remains in them still. But there's also the issue of what this data is being used for. A lot of the time, it's being used to create arguments about the types of people that people are based on these measurements. So there's one guy, Samuel Morton, who he has a very famous collection of skulls called the Morton Cranium Collection. And he would measure the skulls in these not super scientifically accurate ways. There was a bunch of ways to do it. One big one was putting mustard seeds in the skulls. Mustard seeds can be compressed, so you could very easily squash more in if you wanted to. What he would do is he would measure the contents of the skulls, like the volume, and then use that to make claims about the intelligence of the people whose skulls they were, and then use the aggregate data to make racist claims about different races having different intellectual capacity. All of this is used in service of something called eugenics, which is the idea that there is a like human fitness that would be ideal that not all people can contribute to, and that therefore we as people should do something to better the species through selective breeding. This is also called social Darwinism. That's another term for like one example of a eugenic movement. This is very problematic, right? It assumes that some people are better than others. It assumes that there's a scientific basis for this, and then it uses sciencey language to say, like, to make moral claims about what people should do and who should reproduce. This is horrible, right? This connects back to the human zoos and progress narratives that we discussed in previous weeks. This used to be kind of all the rage in anthropology. It went hand in hand with phrenology, which we now call a pseudoscience, but in its heyday, it was believed to be like very scientific. And this was, for anybody who doesn't know the term phrenology, this was the idea that like bumps on your skull correspond to areas in your brain. Therefore, you could determine somebody's personality, moral character, and likelihood that they would do crimes based on, like, if they had a bump on their head here versus a bump on their head here versus a bump on their head right here. That's not how brains work. We know that now. But we did not always know this. And this assumption might sound silly, but what it led to was people being criminalized based on how they looked. And if you're categorizing people based on how they look and then making moral assumptions about them, this can slide into racist claims about people being likelier to do crimes very, very easily. And that's what it does. If you'd like to learn more about the history of this, I can recommend you books. Email me. That goes for all of this stuff. Anyway, another sort of way in which these assumptions of biological difference between races have been perpetuated through science is sorry for the abrupt cut. My dog is shedding and I'm allergic to him, so I had to go take allergy. Anyway, let's get back to it. So, another way in which racist assumptions of biological difference have been used in a scientific context is something called race correction factors, which basically, when you go to the doctor and they run tests on you, all those tests are inventions, right? They had to start somewhere. And a lot of the time, when you're getting a test done at the doctor's office, what's really happening is that the doctor is collecting some information about you and comparing it to an expected result for a person like you. Now, for the most part, that person like you is just a person of your age, because our age shapes our bodies. Right, in a lot of ways. Like, your heart rate changes dramatically throughout your life. And it's supposed to. So normally, when somebody's running a test, like taking your pulse, they're comparing your pulse to what is expected for somebody of your age. When they're taking your blood, for the most part, they're just comparing it to human blood, because your blood is supposed to work the same throughout your life, pretty much. You're going to want to have iron in it. You're going to want to have red blood cells in it. You're going to want to have platelets in it. You're going to want to have, like, a certain percentage of red blood cells versus platelets versus white blood cells. And if there's too many of one and too few of another, that's bad. And that's pretty much the same for like the components of your blood. I promise this is going somewhere relevant. So there's lots of things in our blood, right? And so when we do blood tests, we can figure out quite a lot about how the body's working. They can test for all kinds of things. You know, do you have too much fats in your blood? Do you have the right amount of sugar in your blood? Do you have the right amount of electrolytes like salt or potassium or whatever? And one thing they do is they run kidney tests because your kidneys are really, really important and it's good to know if they're working or not. And the way that one of the main tests for this is something called a GFR, which means glomerular filtration rate. You don't need to know that unless you're into kidneys or a pre-med of some kind, in which case this is very important for you to know. But GFR, glomerular filtration rate, is basically how you measure like whether the functional unit of your kidney is like functioning. So like all the different parts that make up the kidney, are they doing their work, which is to filter your blood and get rid of toxins. The scientists who figured out a way to test for this and figured out like what this is supposed to be, like what the normal range for your glomerular filtration rate should be, which is above a certain number, arbitrarily, based on their assumption that Black people's bodies work differently from non-Black people's bodies, threw in to the algorithm that is used to calculate this a race correction factor that inflates the results for Black people. So basically, the way your glomerular filtration rate is calculated from your blood is like, oh, it's this number. Like if you put the same the same blood from the same person in a lab and had them test the glomerular filtration rate, the result would come back as like X number. Unless you're Black, then it's X number that's higher. What this means is it gives the impression that Black people and non-Black people, even if their kidneys are working the exact same and their blood suggests the exact same result, the result would be reported higher for a Black person. This matters a lot because glomerular filtration rate lets you know if your kidney's functioning. So if your kidney's not functioning, but your test result is being artificially inflated because some scientist 100 years ago said, I assume Black people's kidneys work better than white people's. I'm just going to assume that and put it in this research with no evidence. This can lead to you not getting treatment in time. Like, if you don't treat diseases like kidney failure, that can get a lot worse very quickly and it can kill you. So what this leads to is Black people having worse outcomes for kidney disease. And it also leads to Black people not being as likely to get transplants because one of the criteria for being eligible for a kidney transplant is having a GFR below a certain number, a cutoff point. And same for dialysis. Your kidneys have to be functioning a certain, like, badly enough to warrant it. So your kidneys could be functioning that badly, but your tests, because you're Black, are inflated to say that they're not. Anyway, this denies people healthcare. And this is not like, it's not like individual doctors are saying, you're Black, I'm going to inflate your test results. Most healthcare workers working with these results have no idea that the origin of this race correction factor is just a random guy's racist assumption. Because most people, when you're looking at a medical algorithm, you're like, well, this is what I've been taught. I assume this is how it, I assume I was taught this for a reason. Same exact thing happens with lung function testing. There are 4 criteria used to determine like what your lungs are supposed to look like on lung function tests. If you have asthma, you know what I'm talking about. You go to the pulmonologist and they make you breathe in and then breathe out really, really hard, and they measure how your lungs perform, and they say, oh, you're performing like this and you should be performing like this, and that means that you need an inhaler. They're comparing you to a person based on a couple of factors. And unlike blood, there's a lot more things that can affect your lungs, like how tall you are will affect your lung size, right? I'm 5 feet tall. You might not know this based on the fact that you can only see this much of me in your screen, but I'm 5 feet tall. So I have a lot shorter lungs than somebody who is 6 feet tall. Uh, but unlike height and age, race does not affect your lung size, but the people who invented the algorithms for determining like what your lungs are supposed to, how much you're supposed to get on all of these measures, made the assumption that Black people have lungs that are different from non-Black people. And so, once again, they invented a race correction factor. So you can have the same person take the test, and if you mark them as white versus as Black, when you do the math, that you will get a different result. And just like for kidney treatment, what this does is it makes it harder for Black people to access medications that they might need because their test results are artificially too hot. So here's an example where the assumption that Black people's organs work like differently based on stereotypes about Black bodies um, ends up costing people access to like life-saving healthcare. Um, the good news is a lot of research has gone into, uncovering the real history of where these race correction factors come from, the assumptions they're based on, and countering them. So since 2020-ish, a lot of hospital systems have stopped using race correction factors in some of their healthcare. I'm not going to make the claim that all of it's gone. Oh, whoops. I'm not going to make the claim that all of it's gone because I don't know that, and I would be surprised. And also because this kind of thing happens all the time. And medicine is there's a lot going on in medicine. So I'm not going to make the claim that all race correction factors aren't being used. But at the very least, these example ones that I've given are things people are very well aware of and have been, talking about, as in discussing the ethics of using these and arguing that they're not ethical and should not be used because they lead to inequitable care based on race. Unfortunately, it's not that easy to remove racist hypotheses and their effects from scientific data. Right? Because when racist assumptions are used, are shaping like the science that we're doing, then they're echoed in the results. You kind of get out what you put in a little bit. So then if you have, say, an AI, a language learning model that is training on large data sets, and you give it data sets, say, like all of the skull measurements collected by all of the anthropologists in a certain anthropology department, which are data sets that do exist and are used to train AI, then that AI is eating racist information, and eating information that gives it these very skewed perspectives on what biologically people are like. We'll talk about this a bit more in later weeks, but if that's something you're interested in, I highly recommend reading the works of Catherine McKittrick. We're going to ignore my phone ringing in the other room. So this is really important to understand. I know this all sounds like maybe a little bit arbitrary and abstract, but it's really important because all of this is really getting at the ways in which racism becomes built into structures. Like, even if it's coming from originally some assumptions made by people in power, gets baked into the power systems. It gets baked into the structures. And then it becomes a bigger problem to address because it's not a matter of just changing conscious actions or how individuals treat each other, although that does very much matter. Um, so, one last word on race science is the epigraph to the 2025 section of Parable does start to critique this concept. In this epigraph, Butler writes, intelligence is ongoing individual adaptability, adaptations that an intelligent species may make in a single generation. Other species may make over many generations of selective breeding and selective dying. Yet intelligence is demanding. If it is misdirected by accident or by intent, it can foster its own orgies of breeding and dying. And so eugenics is the selective breeding and selective dying of a population. And one reading of this epigraph is that Butler here is arguing that this kind of misdirection of human intelligence is dangerous and leads to orgies of breeding and dying, or like orgies of destruction. So yeah, that's just one reading of this as a critique of eugenics. Anyway, let's talk about anti-Black racism. So in the US context, race is often reduced when we're talking about like race and its social implications and its history. It's often reduced to this black-white binary, which has a lot to do with our history of participation in the transatlantic slave trade. During enslavement, Black people were not treated as or recognized as human by their enslavers. They were instead seen as flesh. This is a distinction that iconic Black feminist scholar Hortense Spillers makes in her seminal essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, where she talks about like the ways in which enslavement works as a means of dehumanizing people by reducing them to like flesh, which is like living property that is stripped of the markers that we typically associate with not just humanity, but personhood, names, relationships, beliefs, opinions, having a voice, social rules like gender. This dehumanization bears stereotypes that still inspire a lot of violence. Stereotypes about criminal propensity, which we kind of talked about on the last slide. Stereotypes about aggressiveness or like there's a lot of really gross sexual stereotypes that you'll sort of see evidence of in the cultural landscape. And these stereotypes have been used for excuses for like all kinds of violence against Black people, from the disproportionate policing of Black neighborhoods to when disasters strike predominantly Black communities, like when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. The news would often describe Black survivors who were like looking for food and clean water and medical supplies as looters. And there's been studies done of like this use of the term looters, and it's very much used in a racially inequitable fashion to sort of stigmatize Black survival. And then this kind of stereotypes are also used to justify police shootings and lynchings. From the murder of Emmett Till up to contemporary police violence is often, justified through discussions of like, oh, well, like police are trained to shoot first and ask questions later. And the question then is like, well, why were they shooting first if they saw a Black child playing with a toy? Tamir Rice, or a Black kid wearing a hoodie and headphones, or a Black man birding. The list goes on. All of this is obviously very heavy material, and I don't want to brush past that. it weighs very heavily on the present and by extension the future. One really pivoting slightly, a really important stereotype for us to be aware of when we're analyzing Parable of the Sower in particular, but also in general, is that there's this myth that Black people, particularly Black women, don't feel pain. This is a really pervasive myth, and it dates back to enslavement, at the very least. When enslaved Black women were forced to participate in medical experiments that ultimately led to the development of contemporary gynecology. This included being forced to undergo surgeries without pain medication. Um, and these were experimental surgeries that ended up shaping like the kinds of treatment that we still have for gynecological maladies today. But like this myth that Black women and Black people more broadly don't feel pain um, still affects medical care, as Black people's pain is ignored a lot more frequently by medical caregivers. For more on this subject, I highly recommend the book Medical Bondage by Deirdre Cooper Owens. I could recommend other books too. We're going to talk a bit more about this when we get to Parable, because Lauren's hyperempathy syndrome is a critique of this concept and its pervasiveness. So, all that's really heavy and awful, right? Racism and scientific racism and the ways in which it's used to justify violence. And there's a lot more that can be said about this. Again, this is a very cursory overview because of the nature of this class and the limited time that we have together. So what do people do with this, right? How do people imagine a future beyond anti-Blackness? This is the project that inspires Black organizing, like the civil rights movement, like the Black Power movement. And it's the same motivation that inspires contemporary movements, like the movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter. How did and how do people fight for that future? Oftentimes, the history of Black organizing is sort of overly simplified into two paths. We've got the nonviolent path, exemplified by Martin Luther King Jr., and then we've got like a more militant path, exemplified by figures like Malcolm X or organizations like the Black Panther Party. But the reality of Black resistance during this period, which is like the 60s to 80s, is a lot more complicated than that simple binary suggests, and it's also a lot more complicated than that simple binary suggests in our present moment. So civil rights versus Black liberation versus Black power. Let's talk about terms, right? Terms matter. So these are not synonyms. There's a lot of overlap in how they're used and in what they could describe, right? Because the civil rights movement is fighting for Black liberation. But these terms are kind of like rectangles and squares. There's overlap, but they're not the same. Civil rights is, as a movement, like proper noun civil rights, was the movement focused on giving Black people equitable protection and rights under the law, what they're owed in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, right, that all men are created equal, that, and then more broadly also like changing laws to better fit those rights and the dignity that those rights should afford. So things like the Voting Rights Act would be civil rights law changes. Then Black Power is a particular movement also. Oh, and and civil rights more broadly as a descriptor is also that same thing. It is civil rights are the rights that we have as like civilians, as opposed to human rights, and as citizens, as opposed to human rights, which are like everyone has human rights or everyone is supposed to have human rights. Like you don't have to be a citizen of a particular nation to have human rights. But to have civil rights, you are supposed to be like a part of the civil society of that place. So it's a specific legality of like what rights are afforded to citizens versus non-citizens who are still recognized. It's that nuance is above our pay grade for this course. Anyway, Black Power is all about empowerment. It does not need recognition. So civil rights is focused on getting recognition from the law, getting what you are promised according to the letter of the, like, making sure the letter and the spirit, both of, like, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, are actually reflected in how you are treated, so that there is not, like, segregation, or hardships to exercising your rights, barriers to exercising your rights. Black Power, on the other hand, is saying, I don't need the law to recognize me. I don't need to demand that you being the state or those in power, give me equal treatment. I will take it for myself. And then Black Liberation is focused, it's not that it's not focused on empowerment, it's that it's focused specifically on freedom from oppression. So it's more focused on liberating people from oppressive laws and governance. So whereas civil rights is focused on, like, I want to be able to sit at the front of the bus like anybody else. I want to be able to sit in the movie theater like anybody else, or eat lunch in restaurants like anybody else, or vote like anybody else, without, like, these hardships being put in the way, or go to the same schools as everybody else. Black Power is saying, I want political, economic, and social empowerment, and I'm going to make it happen, regardless of how many roadblocks you put in my way. Black Liberation is saying, I want freedom from all of these chains, the chains of oppression on the legal front, the chains of oppression on the social, economic, political fronts. That's more of, like, a philosophical descriptor. So, like, both civil rights and Black Power are kind of like liberatory movements for Black people, but Black liberation is also a broader concept than that, because it also includes, like, liberation from, like, internalized racism, and liberation from political, like, political imprisonment. And all of the figures from all of these movements, because civil rights and Black Power are both specific movements in time and history, whereas Black liberation is, like, the ongoing project. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. That's just useful for thinking. Like, gesturing towards clear definitions for our terms will help us use them more clearly. And then here's some more important context. We're going to talk a lot about the FBI today, specifically something called COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program. This is not my snappy nickname for it. This is, like, its code name. In case you haven't heard of COINTELPRO, although I'm kind of going to assume a lot of you have. So, refresher for those who do know about it, and in case you don't, under J. Edgar Hoover, who was the sort of like the quintessential FBI guy, he ran the FBI up until his death. He was, like, a very, very, very kind of synonymous with the organization. And he was very racist. He ruled with an iron fist. He refused to hire Black agents, and he collected, like, blackmail files on everybody that he could. Politicians, celebrities, and then some of those he was not necessarily supposed to have. And then I take that back. All of this he was not supposed to have, because COINTELPRO was, like, super illegal, and a very big scandal when it came out that this was something that the FBI had been doing. Basically, they ran a secret program for years to investigate anybody thought of as a threat to the status quo. So anti-racist organizing, Black student groups, any sort of like racial or ethnic student group, like Chicano student organizations, or community organizations, Black organizations, Asian and Asian American organizations, indigenous groups like AIM, anti-war groups, anti-patriarchy groups, anti-capitalist groups, communist parties, Students for Democratic Socialism, uh, basically, labor unions, and then actual like underground militias, like the Weather Underground. All of these groups would be like targets for the FBI to stalk, and keep tabs on. They would tap people's phones, they'd put bugs places, they'd collect tips from snitches, they would send out like people to infiltrate activist groups and organizing spaces and community spaces, to spread rumors and show distrust. And they had a couple of goals. Main goal was getting info. Secondary goal was causing infighting among people so that they would be less effective at whatever their goal was. And then the third one was to make people feel very paranoid. Something that you hear a lot if you look into COINTELPRO is like the idea that the FBI's goal was to make people feel like there was an FBI guy behind every post box in America. A lot of high-profile targets of COINTELPRO were assassinated, and we'll talk about that later. And it's still unclear how much of these assassinations was orchestrated by the FBI versus how much was just sort of like the FBI kind of helped a little bit with like setting the stage, like leaking information about where people were, or sowing anger against people. Because one thing they would do is release something called poison pen letters, which they released some of these against Martin Luther King Jr. And these would be like letters sort of saying all of the bad things that maybe like the bad, like, oh, if you cheated on your wife, they would be like, oh, so-and-so cheated on their wife. Or they would accuse you of doing things. And it almost doesn't like, things are things that there's evidence that like people did versus some of the things are maybe just made up. The idea is to like poison people's reputations. If you want more information about COINTELPRO, there's a lot of places you can get this kind of information. I read a very long biography of J. Edgar Hoover, but I don't remember who wrote it. I just know it was called Hoover. But another really great source is actually the history podcast Snafu. The entire second season is all about the story of how we know about COINTELPRO, because this was not something the FBI admitted to. It wasn't even something that most of the government knew was happening when it was happening. The only reason we know about COINTELPRO is because a group of like civilians staged a really fascinating heist in the 1970s, which is they formed a group called the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, and it was like a handful of people, like a couple. A lot of them came out of the anti-war movement at this point, right? And they were paranoid about the role that the FBI was playing in surveilling people, and so they decided to form this group called the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, and they planned a break-in to like but it's also a demand, not the main office of the FBI, but like a small local one in a town in I think Pennsylvania, and they planned it for during the Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier fight because they knew people would be distracted. And they broke into this FBI office, took a bunch of files, and then sent copies of them to journalists. And a lot of journalists were like, "Oh, I'm not going to publish this because I don't want J. Edgar Hoover." You can see his original text here on the screen. There was one other demand of his, and this is a demand of everybody listening, was like, interracial unity and freedom. And so she published them. And he argues specifically the only reason we know that COINTELPRO everybody can work together
without this evidence,
join
everybody who
hands
said, like, oh, you know, I've got the
across
FBI
racial
after
and
me,
religious differences,
sounds
where
paranoid.
everybody
And
actually
that's by design.
free. Similarly,
So yeah, this is a really great
until
source.
the end of
The
segregation,
people who make this podcast
nobody will be free and nobody will be satisfied.
a lot of the surviving members
We can
of these
never be
of this
satisfied,
commission, as
quoting
well
here
as
again, as long as our
they take a
children
lot
are
of,
stripped
like,
of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only.
information from,
And
like,
then
a
lastly,
primary
voting
source
rights.
archive that
We
the
cannot be
surviving members of this group
satisfied
still have, as well as
until everybody can
the
vote
journalists involved
in the
collected over
South,
the years,
and until people
they
who
reference
in the
the
North could vote at this
sort of
time,
like the
feel like they
original
actually have a reason to
recording
vote,
from
feel like they
era,
actually
as
have
well
some
as, like,
say
secondary
in their
scholarship
political
that's come out,
representation.
plus, like, how
So,
people have reflected on
he's
it
got a
over
lot
the
of
years.
demands here.
Great,
And they're
source,
very
highly
understandable
recommend.
demands. And they are
Anyway, this
demands
is
that,
really
for the most
important
part,
because almost
overlap
everybody
pretty
that we're gonna
significantly
talk about
with
was
the
a
demands of
target
other sides
So,
of the sort of
let's
like
talk about Martin Luther King
landscape
Jr.
of Black activism and organizing in this era.
The speech that you read for today
So-
is probably his.
This speech is
I apologize.
explicitly very futurist in its orientation, right? It's all about a dream. He's referencing the American dream. He's referencing this sort of like trope of that's sort of like one of the defining features of how we think about America
jobs and
as a
freedom was
place
what
where
it's
people
called.
have lives and futures.
And
Is a
it's
site
a
where
very
people can
straightforward
dream
speech.
of a better
He's a very
future.
effective speechwriter.
And this
If you
speech
haven't
is
seen the video of him
a
delivering the speech,
demand
I
for
highly
that future
recommend
to
it.
be
One of
accessible
the
to
most
Black
famous
people.
orators of American history.
But
His method of delivering speeches
only
continues
4
to be
years
example
later,
of today.
King
Anyway,
goes on NBC for an interview and reflects on the dream that he voiced in this speech. A lot of the details of
And
like Martin Luther King's
says
history himself. So let's just go into
quoting here.
that dream that I
religious
had that
leader,
day has in many points turned into a
very
nightmare.
dedicated to nonviolent
Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years. And I would say over the last few months, I've gone through a lot of soul searching and agonizing moments. And I've come to see that we have many more difficulties ahead. And some of the old optimism was a little superficial. And now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go. And that we are involved in a war on Asian soil, which, if not checked and stopped, can poison the very soul of the nation. So this quote is really significant for us
drew a
looking
lot of
back
comparisons
on
between
I had a
the
dream
treatment
speech
of
and the
Black people
sentiment
in the U.S.
of that
and
dream
Dalit
in our
caste
contemporary
members
era
in
for a
India.
lot of reasons, right? There's some parallels
So
here with
that's
the
something
idea
cool
of
that you should know about Martin Luther King Jr.
unpopular.
And there's a lot more that we could go
war that
into, but
the
let's
majority of the
focus
nation
on
has been
the
forced
future
into
orientation of the
participating in or
speech right now.
bankrolling.
So
we
King
don't have
was
the kind of
ultimately
draft
targeted
today.
by
Like we don't have a draft
COINTELPRO,
today. We don't have
a smear campaign
it's not
that
the same
featured
situation
pen
it was
letters
during
that
the
tried to
Vietnam
destroy
War
his
with
marriage
war
and his
Iran. It's
reputation,
extremely
and
unpopular.
even suggested that he
as was the
kill
war in
himself.
Vietnam.
And then ultimately he was assassinated in 1968. It's also
got a lot of like racial and ideological stakes similar to the Vietnam War. At that era, it was the fear of and the threat of communism. These days, we talk a lot about Islam as a threat in a similar sort of like the specter of it is held up as this threat to U.S. stability. Anyways, there's like some parallels that we can draw here. But primarily, the relevance for our class in this context is this idea of trying not to lose hope when the dream that you may have held for your nation and for your people within that nation becomes sort of nightmarish because perhaps despite like a great deal of effort and organizing, not much change has happened, or because there is like continued escalation of violence and war, or a combination thereof. So for Martin Luther King Jr., his statement that this dream has turned into a nightmare has to do with ongoing violence and imperialism in the Vietnam War that he connects with ongoing racist violence within the U.S. despite all of his work and all of the work of his peers, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, other sort of like nonviolent Black political organizing groups like those have been working nonstop to change how American society treats Black people in this time. And in spite of all of that labor, things are still really, really bleak. And so he says again in this interview, quoting again, "It's much more difficult to really arouse a conscience during a time of war. I noticed the other day, some weeks ago, Black man was shot down in Chicago, and it was a clear case of police brutality. That was on page 30 of the paper, but on page 1 at the top was 780 Viet Cong killed. That is something about a war like this that makes people insensitive. It dulls the conscience, it strengthens the forces of reaction, and it brings into being bitterness and hatred and violence. And it strengthens the military-industrial complex of our country, and it's made our job much more difficult because I think we can go along with some programs if we didn't have this war on our hand." So, yeah. Our ability to believe in our dreams for the future is incredibly shaped by our context in which we're living. And that involves political context that fuels wars and draws these kinds of divisions. And Martin Luther King Jr. is incredibly cognizant of and very, very directly referencing the ways in which these are interrelated and how this shapes the future that he's fighting for and how he carries on that fight, even if he still has faith in it. Another really important figure from this era and to the history of Black organizing and Black liberation is Malcolm X. Malcolm X is he was a Black nationalist. That's a separatist ideology wherein Black people form separate nations rather than fight to integrate into structurally racist existing ones. He grew up in Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement League, in which his parents were very involved. And so this is sort of where his like nascent nationalism comes from. And his father was, I believe his father was some kind of reverend, so also very religious. And then he, while he was incarcerated as a young man, he joined and then eventually became a leader of the Nation of Islam. So huge figure in Black Muslim circles. He ends up participating in the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca, in 1964. And he returned from Mecca with a very, like a sort of a new perspective. So when he was in Mecca, he saw Muslims of a lot of different races working together on this pilgrimage. And so this sort of like helped him pivot from Black nationalism towards more of a globally focused anti-racist socialism. And then he also moved from the Nation of Islam to Sunni Islam at this time. And then he was assassinated in 1965. And there's still a lot of mystery surrounding the assassination. Again, he was under FBI surveillance and a target of COINTELPRO. And the convictions of the people initially charged with his assassination have been overturned. His children have sued the government and are continuing to sue the government, calling for all of the FBI files to be released, so they can understand the role that the FBI played in his assassination. So all of this is important because Malcolm X is often held up as sort of the flip side of the coin of Martin Luther King Jr., where Martin Luther King Jr. has sort of been uptaken as this like nonviolent, pacifying figure, and like held up as like the more like widely accepted in outside of Black organizing circles figure from this era. Malcolm X is sort of like held up as the more radical, like more threatening of the two. But they're both assassinated and they're both surveilled by the FBI, and they're both, you know, well-respected religious leaders who had a lot of overlap in their demands, even if they had very different perspectives when it came to specifically the role of militancy and violence within fighting for the future that you believe in. So the speech I had you read for today, The Ballad of the Bullet, again, one of his most famous speeches. And in this, Malcolm X argues that Black people are already living separated from white people because of segregation and redlining. They just don't have the power economically or politically that would come from a nationalist separatism. He argues that the only way out of the trap of this economic and political disenfranchisement is through political education and job creation within the community, so that any money spent and earned circulates within the Black community rather than going to shops owned by white people or sort of like being sort of taken out of the community. So he's arguing for unity also, but his argument for unity is among Black people rather than among all races. So that's one difference between Malcolm X and Luther King Jr. Malcolm X argues, whether you're, and quoting here, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a nationalist, we all have the that's supposed to say same problem. They don't hang you because you're a Baptist, they hang you because you're Black. They don't attack me because I'm a Muslim, they attack me because I'm Black. They attacked all of us for the same reason. All of us catch hell from the same enemy. We're all in the same bag, in the same boat. He also critiques the nonviolent arm of the civil rights movement. Explicitly, he is critiquing Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington. So when he says, the government has failed us, you can't deny that. Anytime you're living in the 20th century, 1964, walking around here singing We Shall Overcome, the government has failed you. This is part of what's wrong with you. You do too much singing. It's time to start singing. Stop singing and start swinging. So his argument is that, like, the March on Washington didn't necessarily work. It made progress, but even Martin Luther King Jr. acknowledges that it, like, the changes that he was calling for have not happened at this time, and they still have not happened today, one could argue, especially since we've only just seen the repeal of the Voting Rights Act. So we're taking steps back towards this era. Malcolm X frames his argument by drawing a lot of parallels between nationalist anti-colonial movements in Asia and Africa. There's supposed to be a quote there, but this is a quote from him that says, just as it took nationalism to remove colonialism from Asia and Africa, it'll take Black nationalism today to remove colonialism from the backs and minds of the 22 million Afro-Americans here in this country, and 1964 looks like it might be the year of the ballot or the bullet. So again, political power through voting is very important here. But the difference is, and so is this connection, right? Like, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. both draw connections between, like, the situation in America and the situation in Asia in particular. Although, from the material that we've discussed, this is something that MLK Jr. is doing in his reflection on the speech from 4 years later in that NBC interview. And then, but yeah, the main difference here is the call for separatism and the call for and the call for being willing to start swinging. And then Malcolm X also calls attention to the human rights violations happening within the U.S., specifically the ways in which other human rights violations are being given attention, whereas those being carried out against Black people in America are not being given any attention. So he writes, now you tell me, how can the plight of everybody on this earth reach the halls of the United Nations, and you have 22 million Afro-Americans whose churches are being bombed, whose little girls are being murdered, whose leaders are being shot down in broad daylight. Now you tell me why the leaders of this struggle have never taken recording impaired their case to the UN. That's presumably he says their case to the UN there. Yeah, he's referencing real historical events that are human rights violations. So here are some more significant quotes from the Ballad of the Bullet that really start to talk about futurity, right? Here's where Malcolm X also turns to this future language. When we open our eyes today and look around America, we see America not through the eyes of someone who has enjoyed the fruits of Americanism. We see America through the eyes of someone who has been the victim of Americanism. We don't see any American dream. We've experienced only the American nightmare. We haven't benefited from American democracy. We've only suffered from America's hypocrisy, and the generation that's coming up now can see it and are not afraid to say it. If you go to jail, so what? If you're Black, you were born in jail. This is a really powerful quote for a lot of reasons, and it gets across a lot of his sort of like, it re-emphasizes a lot of his argument, right? He's also arguing against the carceral state. But the reason I want to call attention to this quote has to do with this like line, we don't see any American dream, we've experienced only the American nightmare. Because this is both a critique of Martin Luther King Jr.'s, like, it's not strictly a critique of Martin Luther King Jr. I take that back. This is not a critique of Martin Luther King. He's referencing the same ideology, right? They're both critiquing the same thing. That's what I'm trying to say. They're both critiquing the same thing, which is this American dream idea. Only in the I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King Jr. is emphasizing it and critiquing it at the same time. He's saying, you know, the American dream, that's my dream too, but I can't access it. My people can't access it. We need these things to change so that we can live that dream. Whereas Malcolm X is saying, what American dream? We don't see an American dream because it has been denied to us. So they're saying sort of the same thing, but in different ways. So this is a point where their rhetoric and their argument really start to intersect meaningfully. And it's also a point where the future focus, the future orientation of this movement becomes very apparent, right? This idea of like what has been experienced so far versus what people are going to, and like the denial of access to this dream, right? Because dreams are very future oriented. When people are denied the chance to dream and to access that dream, that's denying people the kind of future that they would want. And he's also arguing that the generation coming up, right, the youth, the future of the people, is very cognizant of this. And he goes on to say, waking up and gaining a new political consciousness. And so, yeah, this is very much like a lot of speeches that are like political in nature, future focused in a very meaningful way. So let's move on to talk about the Black Panther Party. So this is, we didn't have any readings about them, but they are very important to talk about. This is another organization. This is an organization from the same era of Black radicalism that was dedicated to a bunch of different community building projects. Like Malcolm X, they were not opposed to violence and militancy. They were willing to use violence in service of their goals, and they actually cognizantly used a lot of military aesthetics. I should have included a picture here, but they used a lot of military aesthetics, including berets and leather jackets and guns, and they stood in formation and they marched in formation. They organized armed self and community defense, community policing, and so they are not afraid of being militant and looking militant. But that's often what they're reduced to in like common sort of like parlance. And that's a shame because that's really oversimplifying what they were about. They were extremely committed to meeting community needs as well as that kind of militancy. So what this looked like was forming community health centers that provided free preventative health care, acupuncture programs. They actually popularized acupuncture in a lot of ways in America, specifically as treatment options for people who were addicted to heroin. They also provided sickle cell care management for sickle cell because that's an incredibly common disease in the Black community. Basically, the medical care was focused on meeting unmet needs in the Black community. They also provided free breakfast programs. Political education was a really big deal to them. They published their own newspaper called the Black Panther. Many of the leaders were, or still are, a lot of them are still alive today, prolific writers. They also had a critical role in the Section 504 sit-in that in the 70s that got basic accessibility protections for public spaces and sort of was the precursor to the ADA. And then they were a political prison support group. They did a lot of support for incarcerated people. This is a picture from their newspaper. I forgot to link the newspaper in the sources. Oh my god! But there's an archive of it online, and I can. So if you want to read articles of it or check it out, it's a very interesting primary source. So they had sort of a 10-point program, and this is important to talk about because a lot of this overlaps with what Malcolm X wants and what Luther King Jr. wants. So 1, we want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. 2, we want full employment for our people. 3, an end to the robbery by the white man of our Black community. 4, decent housing. 5, education that teaches true history and our role in present-day society. So education that acknowledges Black history and Black present. 6, Black men exempt from the military service. 7, immediate end to police brutality and murder. 8, freedom for all Black men held in prison and jail. 9, Black juries. This is really significant because this is something we still see today. A lot of the time, Black people who are going to trial will end up with a jury of all white people, and that's not really a jury of your peers because that jury might be unsympathetic to the Black experience in a lot of meaningful ways. And then 10, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. And as our major political objective, a United Nations supervised plebiscite to be held throughout the Black colony in which only Black colonial subjects will be allowed to participate for the purpose of determining the will of the Black people as to their national destiny. So, where does this differ from Martin Luther King's desires? Specifically, it's a bit more specific than what Martin Luther King has demanded, right? This 10-point program is like very specific and detailed. But mainly the difference is this sort of like Black nationalism of the 10th point here. And then they don't specify it here, but the openness to violence as a possibility is also a place where their desires diverge. But there's a lot of overlap here with Malcolm X. And specifically, this desire for a reduction in the carceral state, this desire for an end of police brutality, this is something that all of these figures are very, very committed to, as are these economic concerns around poverty as something that intersects with racism in very real ways. So some famous Black Panther Party members that you may have heard of. Bobby Seale is one of the co-founders and the chairman. He's still alive today. He's still actively fighting for civil rights. Dr. Huey P. Newton was the other co-founder and the Minister of Defense. He was a political prisoner and he was killed in 1989. I think he was just killed by somebody from a different organization. I don't think it had anything to do with COINTELPRO, but he was definitely somebody who was being investigated by the FBI. I don't think he was killed by the FBI. It's a little bit later than that. He was just kind of killed by somebody from a different organization. He had a PhD in sociology. Fred Hampton was killed by the FBI, very famously assassinated by the FBI while he was asleep in his apartment. He joined the NAACP in college. A lot of these figures became politically active in college. He became the deputy chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, organized something called the Rainbow Coalition, which was really cool. It was a collaboration between a bunch of different class-conscious and anti-racist organizations in the Chicago area. I think it involved Students for Democratic Socialism, which was like a really big student organization at the time. It involved something called the Young Lords Party, which was a Puerto Rican group that had a very similar sort of political tack to the Black Panthers, but focused on Puerto Rican organizing. And then also some street gangs were involved, I believe, in the Rainbow Coalition. And it was this really interesting sort of space for anti-racist and class-conscious collaboration between a bunch of very different people with similar goals. And yeah, he was assassinated in his home while sleeping. So pretty horrifying. And then George Jackson was a field marshal of the Black Panthers. He was also a political prisoner. He was assassinated while incarcerated by guards during the 1979 San Quentin uprising. San Quentin being a prison in California. Then we have Assata Shakur, who was a political prisoner who escaped and then fled to Cuba and continued anti-racist organizing and political work while in exile for the rest of her life. She died only last year in 2025, and she was Tupac's godmother. So Tupac Shakur, Assata Shakur, yeah, she was his godmother. And then we have Kathleen Neal Cleaver, who is a law professor now. She started out with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and then became the Black Panther Party's communications secretary. So she was like a major spokeswoman. And she still does a lot of work working to free Black political prisoners. That's one of the things she does as a lawyer and professor. And then we have Kwame Ture, who's formerly known as Stokely Carmichael. He also started out with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee before becoming more open to this like Malcolm X's sort of like ideas of like revolution by any means necessary. Right. And I should have said that earlier. That's something that Malcolm X in particular is famous for, is arguing that Black people should fight for revolution by any means necessary. Troy was a dedicated Black nationalist as well, and he coined the term Black Power. All of these figures are writers. All of them, I believe, have written at least one book. They're like very, very prolific writers. As you can see, there's a lot of overlap in terms of the same people being members of various organizations, even organizations that tend to be remembered formally in oppositional contexts, right? Like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Black Panther Party. One of them is typically associated with like, oh, like this is an example of nonviolent organizing versus an example of like more militant stuff. There's a lot of personnel overlap. There's a lot of ideological overlap too. There's a lot of great essays on the nuances of this. One particular really good one is this Teen Vogue article by Holly Genovese. Teen Vogue is has great political articles. So highly recommend. She wrote this article about the selective misremembering of the Black Panther Party and MLK Jr. It's called Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Panther Party shared many of the same ideologies, and she highlights how both were really focused on the intersections of class struggle, poverty, and racism. And then there's this 2020 NPR interview with an author named Peniel Joseph, who wrote a book on how after Malcolm X was assassinated, MLK Jr. sort of took a lot of his criticisms of nonviolence into consideration and sort of reflected on those and like folded them into his own future work. So, as Malcolm X argues in The Ballad of the Bullet, The strategy of the white man has always been divide and conquer. He keeps us divided in order to conquer us. He tells you, I'm for separation and you for integration, and keeps us fighting with each other. No, I'm not for separation and you're not for integration. What you and I are for is freedom. Only you think that integration will get you freedom. I think that separation will get me freedom. We both got the same objective. We just got different ways of getting at it. So this is very, very clearly like a statement about like, as Malcolm X sees it, here's one of the key differences between what I'm saying and what MLK Jr. is saying. And the thing is, we're both actually fighting for the same thing, which is freedom. And this is kind of the point I was trying to make about Black liberation earlier. So what does this look like in today's world? The afterlives of this. Black Lives Matter is an example of how, despite all of these efforts, there's still quite a lot of anti-Black racism structural to American society. And Black people are still fighting for a future that does not involve police brutality, poverty, mass incarceration, and so on and so forth. Political disenfranchisement, economic disenfranchisement. And Black Lives Matter movement folds a lot of the work from this earlier period of Black liberation organizing into what it is doing and how. Black Lives Matter developed organically. It's not an organization. It's a sort of like decentralized movement. So there's like nobody in charge of it. Like there's people who coined the term and who are significant, or the phrase, and who are significant to the history of it. But the movement itself is pretty organic and decentralized. It developed in 2013 in response to the murderer of Trayvon Martin, a Black teenager from Florida. The guy who killed him was acquitted. Trayvon Martin was killed in 2012, and after his killer was acquitted, this sort of movement developed out of the anger that the Black community felt at that decision. So Black Lives Matter is a slogan, not an organization. A lot of groups do use it in their names. And there is sort of like a broader coalitional org called the Movement for Black Lives. And the messaging of Black Lives Matter is really aimed at highlighting how Black people's lives are devalued in America and how messed up this is. And fighting for urgent change to ensure that Black people can live in peace and safety. Right? It's trying to reiterate the idea that Black lives should matter. And also to call attention to the fact that currently, structurally, American society does not treat Black people as if their lives matter. So this resonated with a lot of people in the early 2010s, just like it resonates with a lot of people today, especially in the wake of further police brutality killings. Trayvon Martin was not killed by a policeman. He was killed by just a guy who was racist and suspicious of him. But in subsequent years, there was a lot of police brutality killings. In 2014, there were 3 really big ones. The killing of Tamir Rice, who was only 12, the killing of Eric Garner, and the killing of Michael Brown, which kicked off the uprising in Ferguson. And at the time, there was some people who complained about the rhetoric of Black Lives Matter, arguing that the phrase somehow devalues other people's lives or implies that they don't matter. This critique misses the point, right? Because the point here is, the point of this phrase is that American society keeps acquitting the killers of unarmed Black people, especially Black men and young Black men and Black children, right? Like Trayvon Martin was a kid. Michael Brown was a kid. Tamir Rice was a kid. These are kids who are being killed, and their killers are being acquitted, which is acquitting the killers of people is one way of accepting that these killings, that these deaths are a normal aspect of life in the U.S. So acquitting the killers of unarmed Black people sends the message that it's okay to kill unarmed Black people, or that Black lives don't matter. And so saying Black Lives Matter is an argument against this status quo, saying Black people's lives should matter and deserve to be protected and valued. This same dynamic plays out during the 2020 uprisings in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, all of whom were killed by police. And again, we see this kind of critique of the phrase that misses the point, but we also see like a much more widespread adoption of the phrase, and sort of like a much more massive movement of uprisings. There was a massive uprising, sort of like a mass movement in 2014, but it was not of the same, not quite the same scale as in 2020. But what do all of these have in common? The civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, both of which were in the 60s and 70s, and then contemporarily Black Lives Matter movement for Black lives. What do they all have in common? They're all concerned with conceptualizing and fighting for a world beyond structural racism against Black people and in general. And they're all committed to imagining worlds beyond racism and imagining different ways of resisting and dismantling racist structures. These are key themes for Afrofuturism and Afrofuturist literature, and that's going to be the subject for our next lecture. Here are our sources, except that I forgot to include the link for the newspaper archive for the Black Panther newspaper, so I will put that on Canvas. Hold me to that, please, and I will see you in the next lecture.